Hey guys, welcome to this episode of End Times Bible Prophecy with Britt Gillette. I'm your host, Britt Gillette, and the topic of today's episode is the coming biblical famine. Wish I had a better topic to discuss, and I don't take that lightly. This isn't sensationalism. I know that the phrases I use, I have to account for every word I speak before God one day. And what's coming is truly a biblical famine, guys, unless God intervenes, unless there's a miracle. If you read my newsletter, you know this was a topic back in January of that newsletter, as well as in March. This has been coming. It's been a food crisis. We've been on the precipice of this for quite some time, a number of months before even the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so how this is a biblical famine and how we've gotten to this point is what we're going to talk about now. So let's dive in and look at some articles that will help shed some light onto how we got to the point that we're at now and where I see us headed as we go forward. So let's look at this first article here. Is called Here's How the Energy Crisis Turns into Hunger and Then War. This is by Chris McIntosh. He wrote this back in December on International Man. And the reason I point this out is there's a paragraph in here that I think really sums up the whole situation succinctly. So let me scroll down and find that. This was in my newsletter for those of you that remember that. It says, "You can't make fertilizer without urea and natural gas. As the price of either of these goes higher, and both are, it significantly impacts the price of fertilizer. The price of fertilizer impacts in turn the price of food. This is because fertilizer is the second largest cost component of most agricultural production, the first being, you guessed it, diesel." So keep in mind, all of this was before Russia invaded Ukraine and took this up a notch. Since then, fertilizer is up even higher, diesel is up higher. So we were already having major problems before that for this reason. So we had shortages in fertilizer, we had fertilizer costs going up double, triple in the course of a year, and the impact that that has on farming, along with diesel. Diesel's used to run tractors, diesel is used to bring food all the way through the supply chain, everywhere it goes. And so we were already looking at this major food crisis. And then we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which made this even worse. So when that happened, we had sanctions go into effect. And we see this article from Zero Hedge back in April. It says America's largest farm cooperative warns sanctions may spark fertilizer shortages. And here CHS, largest agricultural cooperative in the U.S., says sanctions could cause delays with respect to or prevent shipments of fertilizer to us, cause inflationary pressures on, and impact our ability to purchase fertilizer. Now think about the impact of this, guys, because you've got the yields on crops are wholly dependent on fertilizer. I mean, that's how we can feed the modern world and so many people, is we get more yield per acre because of these fertilizers. And not only that, but you also feed a lot of the animals, which are our food, whether it's, beef, chicken, milk from cows. All of those animals need to be fed. And they're fed by things we grow. And so when we have these fertilizer shortages, or we see price spikes that cause farmers unable to be able to make a profit, they're either going to go out of business stop making that. They're not going to continue to work free of charge, or the prices are going to go up significantly for food. And that's a major problem going forward. So these sanctions just made everything worse. Something that was already a developing crisis at the beginning of the year was made worse by these sanctions. So here we read more about these fertilizer sanctions. Split farm superpowers as costs surge. The world's Agricultural superpowers are divided over whether Russian fertilizers should be sanctioned as surging prices threaten further food inflation. Brazil, the top exporter of everything from soybeans to coffee and sugar and the biggest importer of fertilizers, argues for keeping crop nutrients sanction-free in the name of food security. So Brazil imports an enormous amount of its fertilizer. Here we see South American nation ships in more than 85% of its fertilizer demand, with dependency on imports exceeding 90% in potash and nitrogen. Russia, the main supplier, and Belarus, which is also under economic sanctions, account for a combined 28% of the total. So if they can't get this fertilizer, if it's not coming into Brazil, Brazil isn't going to be yielding the crops and the exports that they've done in the past. And so that food just isn't going to be there. Next, we have to think about the actual direct impact of this invasion of Ukraine and what that does. So we look at this article, Russian invasion smothers supplies from world's breadbasket. So if we come down here, we can see this paragraph. It's hard to overstate the role that Russia and Ukraine play in the global food trade. The two countries account for more than a quarter of global wheat trade, nearly a fifth of corn, and a whopping 12% of all calories traded globally. So think about that. There's a reason why for hundreds of years Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of Europe. There are a whole lot of countries out there, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, countries like Somalia, Sudan, that import the majority of their food. They're heavily dependent on Ukraine to supply them. Turkey is one of those countries. I think something like 60 or 70% of their wheat comes from Ukraine. So when Ukraine is invaded, and they can't get that out, that causes all sorts of problems. And that's exactly what we're seeing. As we saw last month in this Reuters article, nearly 25 million tons of grain stuck in Ukraine, says UN Food Agency. So nearly 25 million tons of grain are stuck in Ukraine and unable to leave the country due to infrastructure challenges and blocked Black Sea ports. Now, so there is grain that was grown in Ukraine before the Russian invasion and put into storage with the intent to ship it out to the world. That's been stuck in Ukraine. The Black Sea has mines all over it. A lot of the ports, they aren't operational. Ships that want to come in there, they can't get insurance to come in there because they're in a war zone. And so they're just, regardless of sanctions, they aren't going in there. You have railroads that are not operational, roads that have been bombed. You have fuel supplies. The whole supply chain has been hit hard in Ukraine. So even if they are planting or they've already have things that they've harvested in storage, that's not getting out of the country, guys. It's not coming out. It's not coming out to the rest of the world, and that's going to have major implications. We're also seeing bad harvest play into this coming global famine that we're going to see. So in this Reuters article from March, they talked about how China's agriculture minister said the winter wheat condition could be the worst in its history. The condition of China's winter wheat crop could be the worst in history, the agriculture minister said on Saturday, raising concerns about grain supplies and the world's biggest wheat consumer. We're seeing similar things happen all over the world. We've had global rice production set to plunge 10%. Farmers in China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Vietnam, the largest rice-producing countries, could experience reduced output due to soaring fertilizer prices. So there's that problem with fertilizer prices again. On top of all of that, we have the Avion Flu, which has been hitting poultry hard all over the world since the beginning of the year. So if you've noticed that eggs are more expensive at the grocery store, that's because a lot of the egg-laying hens have been hit hard by this avian flu. A lot of turkeys have been hit as well, so they've had to cull these herds. That's hurting our food supply. As we see what's happening now, the recent outbreaks have affected wild birds and poultry flocks in the US, UK, Israel, and dozens of other countries. So this is a worldwide problem. As of today, the CDC estimates more than 37 million poultry birds in 36 states have been affected by the outbreak. So that's in the United States. We're seeing millions of these birds just being destroyed. And that's going to have a huge impact on the food supply, in addition to all of the problems with fertilizer. So here, once again, we see this fertilizer problem and the issue this has. Even if it's available, just having the cost skyrocket, it's causing farmers to say, maybe I'll use less than I used last year. Maybe I won't plant at all. It really depends on the region. It depends on the resources of the farmer, what's going on. But we see this article here from the UK, and it says food prices to surge further as farmers ditch fertilizer due to soaring cost. Figures obtained by The Independent show that sales of fertilizer plunged by more than a third last month, prompting fears of a fall in crop yields that threatens to push up the price of dairy, lamb, beef, and wheat. So this is a problem, guys, with the fertilizer yields is one of the biggest aspects of this problem that's coming. We see here major Brazil soybean grower to cut fertilizer use amid shortage. It says one of Brazil's largest farmers is planning to reduce fertilizer use by more than a quarter next season, relying on more precise applications and soil testing to maintain crop yields. SLC Agricola SA, which cultivates an area bigger than Delaware with soybeans, corn, and cotton, will probably use between 20 and 25% less fertilizer in 2022 and 2023 without jeopardizing yields, according to CEO. Now, I read that and I think, so if they're going to use between 20 and 25% less fertilizer than they used the year before, but it's not going to jeopardize yields, my question would be, why were they using that 20 to 25% fertilizer to begin with? I don't buy that. It's gonna hit the yields, guys. It has to. You can test all the soil you want, more precise applications. They're talking about it as if they were just throwing this fertilizer around and not already using precise applications. I find it hard to believe that this large agricultural conglomerate was unnecessarily using 20 to 25% of its second biggest expense for no reason. They didn't need to do it because, they can get the same yields using less of it. No, they can't. That's put in there so that they can say, hey, don't panic. Don't panic. No, they're going to get a lower yield if they use less fertilizer. It's just common sense. So I can't believe that. And so where does all this head? These world governments see this stuff. They know what's being planted. They know how much fertilizer is being used. And they know that the quickest way to a revolution is if people don't have food. And so what is the natural result of that? Well, the natural result is you're going to see food protectionism. You're going to see bans on exports. So we see this article here. Argentina halts registration of export sales of soy oil meat. Malaysia to stop exporting 3.6 million chickens a month from June 1st. Wheat prices soar as India restricts exports. India's protectionist moves spark concern. Rice may be next. From burgers to breakfast cereal, some key ingredients are being hit by food export bans. Industry experts tell us what might be next. So we're seeing, with all of these issues, nations are turning to protectionist policies. And those protectionist policies are just going to make the situation worse. We're seeing India and Vietnam restricting imports of rice. We're seeing Indonesia has placed a blanket ban on the export of palm oil. Argentina has blocked certain beef cuts. So we're going to see a continuation of these policies that block the free flow of goods throughout the world, and that's not a good thing. It's going to lead to further supply chain issues, and it's going to lead to food shortages. So where does all this ultimately lead? Well, some experts are giving us some of their insights. Here we read, a food insecurity expert predicts there's only 10 weeks of wheat supplies left in the world. So we read down, scroll down in that. And we read, the world has about 10 weeks of wheat supplies stored as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters its 4th month. Sarah Menker, the CEO of agriculture analytics firm Grow Intelligence, told the UN Security Council that the Russia-Ukraine war was not the cause of a food security crisis, but simply added fuel to a fire that was long burning. That's exactly what we've been talking about. We see this article which says, Goya CEO issues dire warning on looming food crisis. President and CEO of Goya Foods, we are on the precipice of a food shortage. We scroll down and we read this quote where he says there's 2.5 million acres of sunflowers to be planted. Farmers will be planting less and yielding less because of the rising cost and lack of good yield. It's going to send food prices spiraling. I want you to think about this for a minute. If 10% less is planted and less fertilizer is used so that we have a 10% less yield, that's 90% of 90%. That means that you end up with 81% of the food production from a year ago. If you get 10% less planting and a yield that's 10% less. That means 19% less food in the world. Just let that sink in for a minute. Here we read this article, Bank of England warns of apocalyptic global food shortage. Governor Andrew Bailey says he is helpless in the face of surging inflation. Governor of the Bank of England is warned of an apocalyptic global food price rise and said he is helpless in the face of surging inflation as the economy is battered by the war in Ukraine. Here we've got a central banker. What do central bankers do? They fiddle around with interest rates, they print currency. You can print all the currency in the world, that doesn't make more food appear. So, as he says, he's helpless in the face of surging inflation because he can't print food. He can't make more food appear on the shelf. He can, governments can hand out all the cash they want. They can give out stimmy checks and food stamps. But if you go to the store and there's no food on the shelf because it wasn't grown or it wasn't shipped to the store, never made it there, it's not going to do any good. So where does all this lead? Here we had this article from back in March. Fox Business, Russia-Ukraine war worsens fertilizer supply issues. Potential widespread famine on the horizon, experts say. So in this article they are interviewing Peter Zehan, not sure if I'm saying that right, a geopolitical analyst and author, told Fox Business the world was on the verge of the worst fertilizer situation in modern history in terms of supply before the Russians rolled into Ukraine. So this was before the invasion of Ukraine. All three source materials that go into fertilizer, phosphate, nitrogen, potash, are subject to abject shortage. And even if the war were to stop tomorrow, remember this was written back in March 10th. Even if the war were to stop tomorrow, and it's still going on here in June, it's already too late. It's too late for the planting season in the northern hemisphere this year. He forecasted the crisis will hit Brazil, Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia the hardest, as they will likely see significantly lower yields than what is necessary to support the global population. Think about that. I mean, what he's saying is there's there's just not going to be enough food in the year ahead to feed everybody. I mean, so I can see the United States increasing our production and our exports by a small amount. There's no guarantee even that'll happen. We've had massive floods up in Minnesota and North Dakota. I'm not sure that our production's going to increase this year in the United States. But in spite of that, he says, but the scale of what we're talking about here is insufficient food for hundreds of millions of people. So, what is the end result of all of this? I don't know. We're talking about the global supply chain. It's a very complex system. Anybody that says they fully understand it and they know exactly what's going to happen, they're lying to you, because there's just no way you can understand small areas. You can understand what you see. You can understand bits and pieces through stories you read and intelligence you gather. But from where I stand, we're headed toward a global famine, and I don't think there's any way around it other than a miracle from God. Why do I say that? Because while I can't understand the full global supply chain, I understand math. And as we said before, if you plant less and you yield less, you end up with less. And if you end up with less, we're in a dire situation. Here I've got this PDF from the Food Security Information Network, and this is a global report on food and the food situation in the world. In it, they say that as of September 2021, so this is last September, 35 million people were categorized as emergency phase 4. What's emergency phase 4? Here they tell us it's one step away from starvation. They call it phase 5, catastrophe, famine. It's on the brink. 35 million people. The United Nations World Food Program, they say up to 811 million people go to bed hungry every night. The number of those facing acute food insecurity is more than doubled from 135 million to 276 million. A total of 48.9 million are facing emergency levels of hunger. So this previous organization said 35 million. UN says 48.9. It's a wide range, but it's millions of people. Millions of people who, before all of this happened, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, before the spike in diesel prices, spike in fertilizer prices, they were in emergency conditions. And so how many of that 811 million are going to fall into those emergency conditions? How many of those people in the emergency conditions are going to fall into the catastrophe category? I don't know. But again, math tells me that it's going to happen. It's going to happen. You can't produce less food and have all these supply chain issues and have massive spike in energy cost and transportation cost and have this not happen. From the best I can find, the worst famine in recorded history in terms of deaths was in China. The late 1950s, early 1960s, they had, the upper bound range was that 55 million people died of famine. If we've got 811 million people going to bed hungry every night coming into this year, and what happens later this year and into next year happens as it looks like it's going to, yeah, that 55 million is, I mean, just 7% of these people falling victim to famine is going to make it the largest famine, largest death toll famine in human history. And so, you know, again, how is this a biblical famine. Why do I say this is a biblical famine? Well, because of the times in which we live. So, Jesus and the prophets told us to look for certain times, certain signs to look for to when Jesus would return, and we see those signs today. We see the Jewish people back in the land of Israel. We see the Jewish people back in control of Jerusalem. We see the gospel being preached all over the world. These are signs that they said to look for. And when we come to Matthew 24, the disciples ask Jesus, they say, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? And so Jesus told them several signs to look for: false messiahs, rumors of war. But he said there shall be famines and pestilences. And if you don't know what a pestilence is, I encourage you to look that up. And I think that you'll find that we spent the last 2 years dealing with something that I can't talk about on these big tech videos without triggering an algorithm that fits the very definition of pestilence. So we're seeing the pestilence, we're seeing the earthquakes, and this coming global famine is very likely one of these famines Jesus talked about. Very likely. I don't know for sure. I think it's either one of these, or it could be a famine from Revelation 6. So in Revelation 6, we start out, we have a global war that takes place. And in the aftermath of that global war, we see a measure of wheat for a penny, 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. So what does all that mean? That basically means you're going to have to work an entire day's wages just to buy enough food to barely survive. So whether that's massive hyperinflation or food shortages, the result is the same. There's a lot of people are going to suffer and a lot of people are going to die. And it says, power was given unto them over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and with hunger, that's famine, with death, and beasts of the earth. So is this coming famine from Revelation 6? If it is, this is Revelation 6. This is describing the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation. Are we that close to it? We may be. If so, then the tribulation's coming up very, very soon. If not, I think it's probably more likely that it's one of these famines that Jesus spoke about as a generalized famine. Either way, guys, I think we're headed to a biblical famine the end of this year and into 2023. And the only thing that's going to stop it is a miracle from God. So you ask, what can I do? What we can all do is we can get down on our knees and we can pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he stops this. Because that's the only way we're going to get out of this, guys. You can't plant less, fertilize less, have Ukraine completely shut down. You can't have all these things happening, have droughts and bad crops and floods, and end up with enough food to feed everybody. So unless God intervenes, we're heading into a biblical famine, guys. I don't know how else to put it. And I know this is a lot of doom and gloom sounding stuff, but I want you to keep in mind, Jan Markell with Olive Tree Ministries. She has a saying, the world isn't falling apart, it's falling into place. And so, as a believer in Jesus Christ, when I see these types of news stories, I'm heartbroken for what I see coming on the world. But my hope is in Jesus Christ. And I see this, and I see Jesus spoke of this. He knew this was coming. God is in control. God knows this is coming. God knows we're going to face trials and tribulations, but we can have hope because we know how it all ends, and we know that He has overcome the world. So keep your head up. Prepare for this, guys. I encourage you to prepare for this. Again, you can pray. The best way to prepare for this is to pray. But make sure to have a deep pantry. Set some food aside for yourself, for your family, for your neighbors. When you go to the store, pick up a few extra cans of food and set them aside. Your local food bank could use those now, but they're really going to be able to use them 6 months from now. So if you start collecting just a few cans every time you go to the store, you're going to have a good stockpile that you can give to your local food bank at the end of this year. You can also set aside some cash, just a little bit, a few dollars each week. And at the end of the year, what's the purchasing power of that cash going to be? I don't know. My guess is it's not going to buy nearly as much food as it would buy now. But you could give that to a charitable organization that can help feed some of those people that are living in countries that rely on imports for most of their food, because they're really going to be in a world of trouble, guys. So we need to be preparing ourselves to be the hands and feet of Jesus, preparing to be able to help our families, our neighbors, and people all over the world. So keep all of this in the back of your mind. Be preparing for it. I wish I had better news, but again, all of this is good news because it means that Jesus is coming back and he's coming soon. So keep your head up, keep your eyes on him, and God willing, I'll see you next time.